So how do you take the BS out of business speak? Well, that's what we're going to cover today.
Welcome to Fordify Live with your host, Ford Saeks.
Now, to help solve this challenge, we have a couple guests today on Fordify Live. We are live right now on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube and a few other places. And so maybe you've seen Bob's TED Talk. It's got 50, 70,000 views on it. And we have Tim Etoad here to discuss it. But for the listeners and the viewers today, because this is also the podcast, what are you talking about with, the BS in communication, or what is it?
Well, Ford, first off, thank you for having us. Tim and I wrote this book, How to Take the BS Dictionary. So that's why we're experts in this field. So BS can mean, depending on the language, can mean either bullshit or business speak, depending on your point of view. And what we're all about is how to take the BS, the negative BS, out of your business speak, because it can provide issues and complications on the job.
So the real challenge here is that a lot of people, they've started to adapt these new terminology, these new terms, and they use it in business, and they use it because they think they're being fancy or communicating, but in reality, they might be overcomplicating it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's happened in business in particular is that it's become very specialized. So like every industry you're in now is a very specialized industry. I work in marketing. We have our own marketing terms. And sometimes when we talk to clients, they have no idea what we're talking about. And I think we have to do a better job if we're going to communicate and be effective, especially with others. Like, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that we're not excluding people from the conversation?
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. So for BS, when I do my keynotes, I talk about BS being belief system, right? And because you can, it's a little play on words just like you do with BS. And, so in marketing, when I go to hire someone, and, Tim, you and I both own agencies, and this is what we do on the other side of our businesses. And, I use a lot of marketing speak because it's relevant to that industry. Now, do you feel like that's still not something you should do? Or do you feel like, see, to me, if someone comes into my office and they want to interview with me, I'll give you an example. So on this live show, we have franchise brands, and Bob and I spoke at Garage Living. That's where we met up in Canada. We did a presentation. He was an opening keynote and was the MC, and I was a general session speaker. And so that's where we met. And I said, hey, you'd be a great guest on the show. And so that's why we're here today. And so I've got franchise brands, I've got franchisees, I've got CEOs, C-level executives. But when I talk to franchising, if I don't say multi-unit owner, FAC, franchise advisory council, if I don't use those terminology, then they don't think I even know the industry. So I'm sure there's two sides of this coin, right?
Yeah, I think I'd boil it down to basic marketing, which is know your audience, right? So if your audience gets these terms, if they use these terms, if they are working in these terms every day, yeah, it's great. Use it, because I think you can't be basically a good agency if you're not using it. Okay, on the other hand, though, I think there's a lot of other occasions where you're working, let's say, because we market to a lot of small businesses. So we do a lot of marketing for small businesses. And, we have to, instead of talking about something that's like very specific to Google Ads, we just have to explain it in more plain language. And I think a lot of things are about like taking yourself out of it and understanding where the audience is. And I think that's the point of what we've been trying to write about.
Yeah, I know that. Go ahead, Bob.
If I could, Ford, to add what Tim said, here's an example from my life. So when you mention BS, right? Belief system for you, business speak for us. You use that same term to the same audience, they may not know what you're talking about. Here's an example from my world yesterday. My wife is a chief marketing officer, a CMO. She's been in that role for a number of years. She's very competent, good at her job. I came across a term yesterday that I asked her, what does this mean? And it was a marketing term called CPG. And she had to say, well, it could mean consumer packaged goods. It could mean something else. So that's an example of sometimes the confusion with even a audience that knows what you're talking about. There's different acronyms and different definitions of different terms. So what I lean on as a former journalist is our rule of thumb in journalism is on first reference, just spell it out. CPG, otherwise known as consumer packaged goods, and then from that point forward, CPG up and down.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good point for the listeners here. It doesn't matter what your role is, whether you're in executive leadership or whether you're a staff member. The purpose of communication is the response it elicits, right? So I've had my agency for 34 years, and people always tell me, well, we've got our brand message, and like I heard on your TED Talk, you were talking about SWOT analysis and things. So, I always want to make sure it doesn't matter what the person's communicating. It's what the recipient thinks, right? It doesn't matter. I don't know if anybody's got any significant others out there. Never argued with your wife, spouse, or significant other. You've had one intent, and the perception of that intent is different, right? And so from a marketing standpoint, especially, a Hall of Fame keynote speaker that does this for a living, anytime I speak to an audience, I'll probably spell it out the first 3 or 4 times to anchor it in so that they get it. And then I'll make sure that they we can use those terms because it just makes it easier. So to me, I think there's two sides to it. I think it's important. I think the biggest, what I'm hearing as a listener from you guys is what's really essential is to not lean into too many acronyms or too many, I guess you'd call it acronyms.
Yeah, they're acronyms, but they're also, terms of speech.
Terms of speech.
Things that, yeah. So you may not know
slang.
Yeah,
would you call it business slang?
An acronym like ChatGPT. A lot of people don't know, right? That's the GPT is actually generative pre-trained transformer. I mean, it's it's weird language that we create like that, but it's also just push the envelope. A lot of people who may not be American may not understand that term, right? So there's a lot of terms that we use that just come up in whatever industry we're in or whatever business we're in, and people may not necessarily know it if they're not familiar with it already.
Do you also find that it's from a generational differences?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Bob, if you want to take that first, but go ahead. I mean,
now I was thinking just to to add on to what you said, Tim, and to answer your question, for drinking the Kool-Aid to me is a perfect example where Americans, we've heard that for decades, right? And we know what that means, but to somebody over in Europe, I've given that phrase to an audience and asked them to raise their hand if they know what it is, and it's very few people who know what that means. The other thing, generationally, as you were touching on, Ford, the younger people may use it in America, but they don't know the context of where it came from, and so you may say it kind of inappropriately because you don't understand the history of that phrase.
No, I totally understand that. I used to use that phrase, and I have used it on episodes before. But then when you actually look up the origin of it, and it's where everybody died because they drank the Kool-Aid,
right?
Then it's not, if people really were thinking about what the origin is, they probably wouldn't use it so often, right? It's just like, I think the word shit is stacked high and tight or something like that. Like there's the actual meaning meant it was actually a physical description, but then the word is turned into a cuss word, right? And since it's my show, we can do that. So we're all good there.
Right.
So tell me more about, how you came up with this idea for the book. How are people using the book? Who's the best ideal reader for the book? How do people use, so once they recognize, okay, this is a problem, or maybe they don't even know it's a problem, what do they do?
So, I think one audience for the book that we found is that people have said, oh, my kid's graduating from college, and like, this is sort of a funny way to introduce them to like the business world, because the business world is very unique. It's, and especially if they go into particular areas like technology or other things where they're creating new terms all the time. I think the book can be pretty useful because there's a lot of speak that goes on in these things where if you're just fresh out of college, you have no idea what people are talking about.
So curious. Oh, go ahead, Bob.
I also think an international audience, we're much more international in our business world every day. And a lot of the terms we define in the book are, leaned on by a lot of American business people. But if English is your second language, you may not know what EBITDA means, for example.
Right.
And this book helps define those things.
So is this something where you guys have thought about creating your own GPT?
Oh, that'd be fun.
Okay.
Ford,
just the
other day.
So here's what I want you to do. Now, this is just like it's just us, even though we're live right now, right? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to ChatGPT, make sure you're logged in to ChatGPT so you can use 4. And actually, if you go to Google and you type in how to create a GPT, it'll give you the right login because it's not right from your main account. It's from your profile account, not GPT account. But when you get in there, you can create a GPT. So like for my book, I've got Accelerate. Let's see right here. So this is the franchise book that I have, Accelerate, the ultimate guide to franchisees to maximize local marketing and boost sales. And so in here, I've got a chapter on creating partnerships, and I've got one on how to overcome sales objections, right? Because a lot of people in franchising, they don't necessarily get taught how to do that. And so I was able to take the Word document manuscript, go to ChatGPT, answer a few questions, and then upload that chapter and say, this is what I want you to be trained on. So it uses the engine, and it can take your whole book. So for those of you listening to the podcast episode, we're talking to Bob Wiltfong. It's Wiltfong, and Tim Ito, which is ITO, and he's the co-founder of marketingniceguys.com. And then Bob's site, of course, what we're talking about today is thebsdictionary.com. So you guys can go check that out. There it is. He's got the book in there. That's perfect. That's good. I like the cover. And so because this is a podcast too. So here's the thing. When you upload your content and you create a GPT, you can tell it, do you want it to be private? Do you want it to be public? And you can also embed it on your website. So you guys today could go create a GPT, which would take the content. You could tell it, I only want it to bring content from the book. And then basically you've got an AI bot that's your book.
That's awesome.
I love that idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, and again, and we're both marketer guys, but the reason I think of that from an innovator standpoint is, yes, anybody could go to Google and type in what is EBITDA, right? They could do that. Right. But what this is a different take on it, which is, one, the importance of communication, whether you're in leadership, management, team building, communication, culture, communication is the foundation of everything. I believe that it doesn't matter what it is. If there's a conflict, it's communication, right? It's a difference between sending and receiving, and perception and intent. So I think that's really important to have a book like what you guys have come up with. But I would even call it more than a book, because I don't know. Now, do you do training for organization on this? Is it a keynote, or is it just kind of a book that you guys are selling?
We've done all the above. So for instance, I just went to Vienna, Austria a couple of months ago, and I did a keynote on how to take the BS out of business speak, which is also mirrored in the TED Talk that's out there that you mentioned earlier. And then I did an education session in a small room about, diving deeper into the topic. So it's both. And of course, we want to sell books.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a resource, right? So it's a great resource that everybody should put in their, success library. And I'm sure they can get it on their favorite book reselling place. It's not really an ebook yet, is it? I can't imagine you read it into I wouldn't think the consumption method wouldn't lead itself to an audiobook, but certainly a book that someone should have on their shelf they can grab. Now, do you give other definitions to the same thing? So if there's an acronym or slang, do you give alternate, just like you would in a dictionary where it gives you alternate definitions?
Yeah, so we do the real definition and then sort of the funny definition that part of the book, I think, and part of that, I think Bob's genius around the book is that it sort of makes fun of these very, something that's very easy to make fun of, which is like the way people speak. And I think, especially in business settings, and I think, so we try to make light of certain things, whether that's eating your own dog food or whatever it is, right? So I think there's a number of phrases that people use that are just, I think to an outside observer, it might be considered a little strange, right?
What are some of your favorite terms, or what do you feel like some of the biggest ones that are overused? Or
well, I personally love, one of my favorite parts of the book, and which Tim's been instrumental in, is we also provide the origin stories of these terms.
Oh, that's cool.
So Tim mentioned pull-up. And there's an origin story with do the right stuff, right? Or the right stuff, I'm sorry, with that book. That's where that comes from. So my favorite term, because of its origin story, is I have two, steal my thunder and boondoggle. And I can tell you the origin stories if you want to hear them, but we're here. We can go as long as my show. Tell me the stories. Okay. I'll tease you on. I'll just give you one. Steal My Thunder is rooted in bitterness, which that's part of the reason why I love it. So it's from England. There was a theater who was also a playwright. He wrote a play for a theater, and he had to recreate the sound of thunder. So he made a thunder machine that sounded like thunder for his play. His play, unfortunately, did not do well. It closed very quickly after opening. So he came back to the theater to watch the next production in that theater, and they used his thunder machine in that play. And he said, they stole my thunder. So that's where that origin story comes from. And he just was boiling about it. Like, those bastards. So I love that.
What was the other one? Or
Boondoggle.
Oh, yeah.
Boondoggle, which is rooted in, well, where do you think boondoggle comes from? Take a wild guess. What is the origin of boondoggle?
I would have said Old England or the Old West, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good guess. It comes from the Boy Scouts or the Cub Scouts. I think it's the Boy Scouts. But where it comes from is at these camps, these kids would put together these little, trinkets, and they didn't have a name for the activity. So one of the Cub Scout leaders or one of the Boy Scout leaders just made up a word. He said, "Oh, we'll call it a boondoggle." Well, lo and behold, the Depression hits, right? FDR comes into office and he creates all this New Deal funding for out-of-work white-collar workers. And one of the they did was teaching these out-of-work workers how to teach others to make boondoggles. Well, the Republican Party that's opposing FDR's efforts say this is an example of waste. We're spending millions of dollars on these boondoggles. And that's where it became synonymous with, a trip in the business world that's really not necessary. It's just a waste of money.
All right, so I've got one for you.
Okay.
And this is one that I think I know the origin for, but when I told somebody else it and tried to Google it, I couldn't find it the way it was. So I play poker on Friday nights with a bunch of guys, and when they're betting around the room and someone wants to call, one guy said, "I'll be your Huckleberry." And I said, "Okay, do you know what that is?" And he said, "Well, no." And I said, "Well, what it means is back in the day when someone would die, it was a hucklebearer. On the outside of the coffins, those are called huckles. And the bearer would be somebody who would carry it. So by saying, 'I'll be your Huckleberry,' was to say, I'll carry your coffin. I'm that close to you that I'll carry your coffin." Although when I Google it, I can't find that. Now, I heard that years ago in a similar situation where someone was explaining the origin. So I'm curious, is that term in your book? And if so, what's your definition of it?
It isn't in the book, but I think what we did find is that sometimes the origins are also they're hard to pin down, right? So I think some of it, when you kind of do the research into some of this stuff, it's like, is this really this? And people are speculating. The internet's sort of this crazy place where people say, "Oh, it came from here." It actually didn't come from there.
Yeah, we all know, for those of us watching, you can't believe everything you see or hear on the internet. That's for sure.
You can't believe everything you see on the internet. I think what's interesting for us, I think, when we were doing the book, is that there were a lot of origins where there were competing origin stories, and it's hard to tell which ones were actually correct versus not.
Yeah, and I think too, just like in marketing, some things will make you smarter. But it's like, even when Tim, like you and I have agencies, if we have clients, sometimes they really want to know the definition of something. I'm like, that'll make you smarter, but it's not going to help you perform better or make you any more money. So let's just let that go. Like, I don't want to get them caught up in a definition that isn't relevant to, the outcome. Bob, you were going to say something?
Yeah, Ford. And that was one of the discoveries that Tim and I made in writing and researching this book. The old saying that history is written by the victors? It's really changed in today's world, especially in business. History is written by those who are really good at SEO. That's who wins, because you can find the real origin story, but it may be on page 5 of your Google search. So whoever has the SEO at the top is probably going to win the day. And over time, that story is going to be attached to that phrase. So we found examples of people who are trying to own different BS terms,
right,
or make BS terms and saying, "I founded it." So what was it? Yak shaving was an example. We put that in the
digital
book.
native. So like, if you look up on Google, you just do a Google search for who coined the term digital native. And it's Google will actually give you an answer now. So they're trying to, obviously from an SEO standpoint, they're trying to make it easier just to give you the answer where you don't have to leave the search engine. And the answer they'll give you is Mark Prensky, but actually Mark Prensky really wasn't, he popularized the term, but he really wasn't the person who coined the term. So I think if you get deeper into some of this stuff, it's kind of really fascinating.
All right, well, let's shift it back to the business world, which, everybody's struggling in one of the three areas. They're either struggling in operations, in the customer experience, marketing, or sales. What do you feel? So we know that there's a challenge out there that some industries and some communications, certainly it happens with insurance and financial services professionals and real estate agents. When I first started speaking to those industries, they would use all these terms and I would be nodding my head. And then I'd spend a half an hour trying to figure out what the heck were they talking about with all these terms, because I didn't know, what they were. And I think that that's the big mistake that I think a lot of industries do. So one of the action steps I would say for the listeners and viewers would, one, go get the book. It's a great read. I haven't read it. I'm telling you transparently, I haven't read it yet, but just listening to what and how you guys put it together, I think it'd be a fun read. It'll be a great addition to my success library. So that'll be fun. And with my team, I always like them to be educated on these things and to be able to use it. So one, get the book. Two, take a look at your communications through the customer journey, everywhere from you have suspects and prospects and qualified leads and, clients and customers to advocates, and ask yourself, how well are you really communicating in that? And are you using jargon to try to sound smart, which actually alienates the customer? I know I worked with, I had a high-end consulting client with me, and we were working, and he was a financial advisor, and his main clients had, $50 million and above. And when I would talk to him, he was just so caught up in his terminology, he made no sense. And so I finally said to him, I said, look, Bill, you're going to have to change your language. You're not connecting with your key target prospects that make $50 million. It wasn't that they aren't smart and didn't know the terms. It was that he wasn't personalized. In the financial services industry, if you make your client feel stupid because they don't understand something, they're not going to work with you. So, it was really about improving the communication and getting down to natural communication. I think communication is even harder now with the internet and social media and all these different things. So I know that the younger generation, when I say younger, I'm talking 30 and under, not, 12. There's so many terms that they're using. How do you keep up? I mean, I don't even know what to do there.
Yeah.
I mean, we work a lot with lawyers, and I will say that they sometimes are the worst offenders, right? They say something and no one has any idea because they're using legal terminology to common people. So I think that's an example of what you said throughout the customer journey. You have to be really good at sort of understanding who that person is and that they don't know what this legal term means, right? And we see that all the time.
And Tim, you mentioned earlier about know your audience. It's meet people where they're at. So Ford, you talked about, Tim and I are not suggesting you have to dumb down your communication. Just the goal of communication is to bring people to ideas and bring them together, not to separate them. And if you're using these terms because you feel like it builds up your street credibility, to your point, Ford, it may actually be working against you. And so, here's an example of a phrase. I will ask my son when I'm at home, hey, Sawyer, can you give me, how long is it going to be before you're ready to leave? And at work, I'm much more likely in today's world to say, hey, Sawyer, is it scalable for you to give me an ETA on departure? We need to leave ASAP, right? So it's just questioning, why am I these words? Does my audience fully comprehend it? That's what we're going for. And being aware of the pitfalls of some of these language choices with your audience.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So one more favorite term. What would you, maybe you each have one. Give a term that's maybe commonly confused or overused, and that we just need to get back to reality.
Tim,
I don't know, Bob. Do you want to take that first? I have one that I use, but I like.
Yeah, for whatever reason, I've used it and I still use it from time to time. But there's a little part of my soul that dies every time I use it for whatever reason, and that's synergy. It just feels
it's mine too. I was gonna let you have that one, but it's mine too. I hate that word.
Yeah, and I don't. I understand there's a place for it, and it does capture an idea, especially in the business world, that's kind of unique. But it feels manufactured. It feels very busy. I don't use it at my home. I don't talk to my wife about synergy between us. It feels very businessy. And therefore, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way.
So question on that. I don't think it's before we get to the next one, Tim, I don't think it started that way. I think that synergy was a great word to introduce ideas and how the sum of two things were bigger than the individual pieces. I think there was a lot to use for that. It just got overused. Kind of like after COVID, everybody was pivoting, right? Pivot. Yeah. Pivot was another one of those words that I don't use. I don't use in my marketing. I don't use because, every speaker on the planet was talking about pivot, even in their titles. And I was like, I just want to stay away. When everybody's zigging, I want to zag. I want to go the opposite of what the herd is doing. Tim, you had one or a comment?
I was going to say the other one was zeitgeist. I can't stand zeitgeist. It's just one of those words that was created. It was I don't want to say it got popularized certainly with Silicon Valley and like all the kind of capturing the public imagination at that particular moment. I think it's just now one of those terms that's just way, way overused.
Well, we go live, everybody, Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Central on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. And then this also becomes the podcast for the Business Growth Show on your favorite streaming platform. Well, any closing thoughts that you guys have before we end? And then when we end, stick around in the green room. So any closing thoughts that you want to leave people with? Or I know they can go to your websites, get a copy of the book, the BS Dictionary, and go to thebsdictionary.com.
Yeah. And just ask yourself every time you speak to an audience, it's not about dumbing down. Am I communicating in a way that serves the audience, doesn't serve me? That would be my takeaway.
My take is it's not just kind of the language you use. It might be the references you make. And I'll give you an example. I tell a joke to my class every year, and it's my BMW joke. And half the class is American, half the class is actually from overseas. And my BMW joke goes like this: what's the difference between a porcupine and a BMW? And the class goes, what's the difference? And I said, well, on a BMW, the pricks are on the inside. And so half the class laughs because they're the Americans who kind of understand BMW drivers may not be like the greatest human beings necessarily on the planet, but the other half of the foreigners don't laugh. And I think they don't laugh because they don't have the experience. Their BMW drivers are probably perfectly fine. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about what references you make, how funny you are, all those things. A lot of that is going to depend on your creativity. A lot of it is depending on that shared understanding. So always understanding where your audience is.
Well, I know we were getting ready to wrap up the end of the show. I just have another question. Are there terms that you guys came across in the research of producing the book that people use, but they don't know how offensive they really are?
Open the kimono is widely used, offensive to the Japanese culture. It makes reference about a woman revealing her naked body. It's still sometimes used.
I've heard it.
Yeah,
I used one when I first started speaking. We're talking. I was in my 20s, a long, long time ago, decades before a lot of our listeners were born, and I used the term off the reservation once. And obviously that's not to be used. So for those, don't anybody edit this episode and take that one clip and say that I said that, because that's not what I'm saying. But I think there's sayings that people use that they don't even know what they are. I'll tell you a quick story since we're this far into the episode. For those people that stuck around this long, I'll give you a bonus treat. So, do you know what the word schmuck means?
No. I know what it means.
Right. It means normally we'll just call it someone's being a jerk, or we could elevate those words, right? Well, here's the deal. I did an ad, Tim. You'll laugh at this probably. So I invented some products in the sporting goods industry, and I used to advertise them in the back of Popular Science and Popular Mechanics magazines. They used to have, for those of you listening, they actually had printed magazines that people would go into the store and they would buy, and they had pictures and articles. And in the back, they'd have classified ads. And so I had a classified ad that said, "Don't be a schmuck." And then there was, to catch their attention as the headline. And then I had a bunch of whatever the details were whatever the product and service I was selling. And back in those days, when you did that type of advertising, they would print 3 issues in a row. So if you wanted to advertise in the February issue, they would print February, March, and April. So you'd get 3 months. They'd print them all at once. They gang run it. So they were always 3 months ahead when they printed. So when you paid for an ad, there was no changes for the next 3 months. You couldn't change anything. Well, they send the ad out, and they start getting all these calls. Well, schmuck is actually Yiddish for your top of your you-know-what. So it's the crown of the penis, and that's actually the Yiddish word. So it's like a medical term. It's the schmuck. It's the top of the penis. Well, people, you could say dickhead, right? I mean, so, but people use it. I was at a conference and someone used it. I'm like, do you know what that is? And so to a lot of the people, they didn't know. They were just using it because that's what the culture thought it was. But in reality, just like you said, open the kimono, in reality, it was super offensive. So what happened? Anyway, I got banned for life from those 2 magazines because they had to send the other episodes. They couldn't reprint thousands of magazines. So for 3 months they had that ad in the back, which was, I kind of laugh at it now, but I was 23 or 24 years old. I didn't know. I was just thinking that was right. So I think the lessons here are, be careful what you say and be conscious and be open to change. I mean, if you do say something and someone calls you out on it, be open to say, oh, that's interesting. I should probably change that.
Yeah.
Right.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for being here for this episode, and tune in next week at 11 a.m. Central.
Thank you for tuning in to Fordify Live. Make sure to like, comment, and share this episode on your favorite social media platform. And don't forget to subscribe to the Business Growth Show podcast, available wherever you get your podcast streaming fix. We air weekly at 11 a.m. Central Time. So until next week, keep pushing the boundaries and never stop growing.